Okay, so this is I will now talk about making of the pigments that we'll actually use. And so we'll do this after the session, but I just use a little tiny, this is probably, I don't know, I'm guessing three ounce Rubbermaid container with a plastic lid on it. And I don't know if you can read this, but it says Jyoti icon. This is where I make the egg solution. And what it is, it'll be the egg yolk, the egg yellow of one egg, and I'll mix in about 4 parts of wine. So there's a big joke here at the monastery that I'm the only monk in the monastery that has his own bottle of wine. So I don't drink it though. But that's what this is for. Then when I'm painting, I have, you see here, 2 different trays that I use, and usually only one is needed, but as I get further into the process, sometimes I'll start working with 4 or 5 different colors or variations, and so sometimes it's nice to have if I want to introduce a new color, just to have a smaller palette here. And so that we need these. Also, I'll be working with very small quantities, so you see that it's, these areas are quite small. So I use an eyedropper, and when I will transfer the egg solution, I'll just get it into the stopper here and then put it into the trays. I'll show that probably later. Also, I'll have a glass of water, so to clean the brush. I'll have 2 actually. I'll have one for cleaning brushes and one for diluting the solutions, the colors. So even though it has the egg with wine, I'll also add a little bit of water to it at times. And that's all something that you learn as you're going along. Just one of my favorite stories is I was doing a retreat with Vladislav with the Prosopon School of Iconology, and I loved it. At the very beginning, he mentioned that it's like, don't worry about painting a beautiful icon. You've never done his method, and so he's just teaching it. And he really does a lot of the layering of having colors come through underneath. And so every single time we'd come in and you do like what they call float. You just have a lot of the pigment there and let it dry. And you come in and you do some highlights, some like showing, not shadow, but just the opposite, like where the light is hitting where the light is hitting a fold or something. And then you let that dry. And then you come in with a slightly different color and do another float over that. And then you do another highlight and another float. And so you start this transparency, this almost radiance starts to happen. And when we were doing the floats, every single time we did it, I kept putting too much pigment into it. And so it was like very opaque, and it would block out everything I'd done behind it. And he came up to me after doing that 2 or 3 times, and I wasn't too worried about it because, like he said, you've never done it before. You don't know how much you need. And so he came up to me, he goes, I think it's because you're a monk. You float too much. So I have to learn not to float as I'm doing my icon painting. But and what he meant by that was there was too much pigment. I needed to dilute it down quite a bit. So I spent actually an entire month just doing one icon of the baby Christ Emmanuel, and was just doing the robes over and over and over again. And fortunately, I was living in a Christian monastery at the time and was able to give all those icons away. So they found homes. But so that's, you'll find yourself just how much liquid you need into your paints, how much pigments to use. It's an all learning process. Myself and my teacher, Father Damien, have a pretty small palette of colors that we use. And so he gave me this set when I first started painting, and it has titanium white, red oxide, cadmium red, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, Mars orange, cadmium oxide green, is it Prussian blue, and ultramarine blue. And there's certain ones that I use more than others. And so I definitely use the titanium white and say the red oxide, and for some reason I love burnt sienna. And the yellow ochre is probably the one that's gets used the most. And so I actually have like like a pound of that. Whereas, you know, like this one here, which is the burnt sienna, like you can see it's not much in there, but I could probably paint every day for a year and just use that much of that. And some of these, especially like the ultramarine blue, they're so specific and used kind of for things like jewels, or they're not used so much. So it's like that's probably my original amount right there. You'll find your own color preferences. I also have these I do use a little bit more, and again the burnt sienna, so I have a larger quantity of this. This is 100-gram solution of that. This is a darker red, Venantine red, and I do use black. Black is actually used very sparingly, and you're not doing dark shadows. It's an icon is about light coming through. So we very rarely use black, but it does get used. Like you can see here, I do have Mary's hair is black. I've tried painting this various ways where it's actually more color coming through, but as soon as I put just the tiniest bit of black, it just goes black. So I'm still trying to learn that, and I probably would do it more with colors instead of black. And do use a lot of white, so I have a large quantity of titanium white. And then the other two colors, Antica Green Earth is one of my favorites. So if you look at some of my earlier icons, especially like Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Mun, I have almost the entire backgrounds behind the images painted with this green. It's quite a lovely green. It takes quite a bit though to get the opacity. And then for the very, very first color that I will put down on the board, this is Italian raw umber. And so I will use the raw umber with a little bit of the yellow ochre or raw ochre. And that's the very first layer. And so after I make the egg solution, I'll come back and give a demo of how we put that first layer down. And I'll actually mix it up with this pigment in this tray. And we'll do that. Often I do have in this image here a little bit, this is kind of mixed with the white pigment as well, but this is gold. This is actually this gold flake here. And I do have gold in her, the outer part of her hood. There's gold in those parts of the images. And oftentimes you'll do this in gold leaf, and there's a whole process that there's whole schools just for doing gold leafing and various techniques that can be done with that. Partly as a Buddhist monk, we're not allowed to use money or to have gold and things like that. And so I tend not to use gold, and just using some sort of combinations of yellow ochre, sometimes with a little bit of red or sometimes a little bit of green. And the very first images that I did, I showed them to Father Damien, and he was like, yeah, I keep telling people you don't need to use gold, you don't need to use gold leaf. And he said, you know, the images that I did, I think they're on that website, Icon Yukon, that you can see some of the images that I did with halos that look gold. There's no gold in them at all. It's just learning to use the right pigments. And just real quick, I don't even use this brush here. Maybe if I was doing large sections, I could possibly use that. But there's really only 3 size brushes that I use here. These are basically the same. And you just compare that to my thumb, you can see it's not even that wide. But when I apply the very first layer of paint, or I'm doing these large floods, I will use one of these 2 brushes. And for the fine details, I will use these, which are, this is a 1 round, and this is a 1 round as well. Sometimes I like the long handle just because it's the balance of it. You'll find your own preferences. And so I basically only use these 2 brushes for doing all of my icon painting. Maybe that's laziness, but I find that works for me. And then this was, you can see at the bottom of these brushes, they have this little flat area. And you can use them as tools. You can use them to scratch the surface sometimes. But when one of the brushes I had just the top part frayed enough, I just broke off the end. And I use this as my paint scooper. or pigment scooper. So if I was going to, say this is the yellow ochre, and I'm going to put some in here, I just use it just like that. Yeah, the other thing I should mention is I usually have a lot of tissue paper or paper towel around. So then now that I've got a little bit of pigment on here, I would dip it in the, or maybe get it off first dry and then put it in the water to clean off before I would put this into any other of the pigments, not to contaminate them. Now all of these pigments are from either clays or stones. So like the ochre, like I've heard this is all like clays, and some of the blues and the greens and some of the reds even are probably minerals that are crushed up. And so like this one here, the red oxide, that's probably what this is. And this is a local rock that one of the guys who supports the monastery here brought to me. They were brought me a 10-year supply of this, which I appreciate. And what I would do with this, if I have actually done a painting with this, and it's a really beautiful color, is I'd try to get in here, and this is even too coarse right here to use, but I would go in and get some of the really, really fine particles of the dust, and then I would get a pestle and a mortar and pestle and crush this down into the very fine pigments that you have here. And so I've seen people actually just use like a red brick, do that and make their own pigments. I know in the Christian tradition, and probably also in the Tibetan tradition that do the tonkas and stuff, they will actually make their own pigments. That's part of the process. Father Damien was telling me, I think it's the church in New Mexico, Desert Fathers Church in New Mexico, that there's all the murals that are in the monastery, that the monks and nuns there with his assistants did all the murals. And I think all of the pigments and all of that they have all came from their land or the areas around the land. And so, and I also tend to like to have a cup or some sort of jar to keep my paintbrushes in so I can see where they all are. And it's important to keep them clean and make them last a little longer.